Chapter 2. Agriculture and its implements. The Egyptians were the earliest and greatest agriculturists, and from them the art was learned by the Greeks. Greece in the days of her glory greatly improved the art, and some of her ablest men wrote valuable treatises on its different topics. Its farmers thoroughly plowed and fertilized the soil, used various implements for its cultivation, paid great attention to the raising of fruits, the apple, pear, cherry, plum, quince, peach, lemon, fig and many other varieties suitable to their climate, and improved the breeds of cattle, horse and sheep. When, however, social pride and luxurious city life became the dominant passions, agriculture was left to menials, and the art gradually faded with the state. Rome in her best days placed farming in high regard. Her best writers wrote voluminously on agricultural subjects. A tract of land was allotted to every citizen, which was carefully cultivated, and these citizen farmers were her worthiest and most honored sons. The condition and needs of the soil were studied, its strength replenished by careful fertilization, and it was worked with care. There were plows which were made heavy or light as the different soils required, and there were a variety of farm implements, such as spades, hoes, harrows and rakes. Grains, such as wheat, barley, rye and oats, were raised, a variety of fruits and vegetables, and great attention paid to the breeding of stock. Cato and Varro, Virgil and Columella, Pliny and Palladius delighted to instruct the farmer and praise his occupation. But as the Roman Empire grew, its armies absorbed its intelligent farmers, the tilling of the soil was left to the menial and the slave, and the empire and agriculture declined together. Then came the hordes of northern barbarians pouring in waves over the southern countries and burying from sight their arts and civilization. The gloom of the Middle Ages then closed down upon the European world. Whatever good may have been accomplished in other directions by the Crusades, agriculture reached its lowest ebb, save in those instances where the culture of the soil received attention from monastic institutions. The 16th century has been fixed upon as the time when Europe awoke from its long slumber. Then it was after the invention of the printing press had become well established that publications on agriculture began to appear. The Bouquet of Husbandry, in 1523, by Sir Anthony Fitzherbert, Thomas Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry, Barnaby Googer's The Whole Art of Husbandry, The Jewel House of Art and Nature, by Sir Hugh Platt, The English Improver of Walter Blythe, and the writings of Sir Richard Weston on the husbandry of Brabant and Flanders, were the principal torches by which the light on this subject was handed down through the 16th and 17th centuries. Further awakening was had in the 18th century, the chief part of which was given by Jethro Tull, an English agriculturist, who lived, and wrote, and labored in the cause between 1680 and 1740. Tull's leading idea was the thorough pulverization of the soil, his doctrines being that plants derived their nourishment from minute particles of soil, hence the need of its pulverization. He invented and introduced a horse hoe, a grain drill, and a threshing machine. Next appeared Arthur Young, of England, born in 1741, whose life was extended into the 19th century, and to whom the world was greatly indebted for the spread of agricultural knowledge. He devoted frequent and long journeys to obtaining information on agricultural subjects, and his writings attracted the attention and assistance of the learned everywhere. His chief work was the making known widely of the beneficial effects of ammonia and ammoniacal compounds on vegetation. Many other useful branches of the subject, clearly treated by him, are found in his Annals of Agriculture. It was this same Arthur Young with whom Washington corresponded from his quiet retreat at Mount Vernon. After the close of the War of Independence in 1783 and before the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 and his elevation to the presidency in that year, Washington devoted very much of his time to the cultivation of his large estate in Virginia. He took great interest in every improvement in agriculture and its implements. He invented a plough and a rotary seed drill, improved his harrows and mills, and made many inquiries relative to the efficacy of ploughs and threshing machines made in England and other parts of Europe. It was during this period that he opened an interesting correspondence with Young on improvements in agriculture, which was carried on even while he was president. And he availed himself of the proffer of Young's services to fill an order for seeds and 2 ploughs from a London merchant. He also wrote to Robert Carey & Co., merchants in London, concerning an engine he had heard of as being constructed in Switzerland, for pulling up trees and their stumps by the roots, and ordered one to be sent him if the machine were efficient. Jefferson, Washington's great contemporaneous statesman and Virginia planter, and to whom has been ascribed the chief glory of the American patent system, himself also an inventor, enriched his country by the full scientific knowledge he had gained from all Europe of agricultural pursuits and improvements. The progress of the art, in a fundamental sense, that is in a knowledge of the constituents, properties, and needs of the soil, commenced with the investigations of Sir Humphry Davy at the close of the 18th century, resulting in his celebrated lectures before the Board of Agriculture from 1802 to 1812, and his practical experiments in the growth of plants and the nature of fertilizers. Agricultural societies and boards were a characteristic product of the 18th century in Europe and America. But this birth, or revival of agricultural studies, the enthusiastic interest taken therein by its great and learned men, and all its valuable publications and discoveries, bore comparatively little fruit in that century. The ignorance and prejudice of the great mass of farmers led to a determined, and in many instances violent resistance to the introduction of labor-saving machinery and the practical application of what they called book farming. A fear of driving people out of employment led them to make war upon new agricultural machines and their inventors, as they had upon weaving and spinning inventions. This war was more marked in England than elsewhere, because there more of the new machines were first introduced, and the number of laborers in those fields was the greatest. In America the ignorance took the milder shape of contempt and prejudice. Farmers refused, for instance, to use cast iron plows as it was feared they would poison the soil. So slow was the invention and introduction of new devices, that if Ruth had revisited the earth at the beginning of the 19th century, she might have seen again in the fields of the husbandmen everywhere the sickle of the reapers behind whom she gleaned in the fields of Boaz, heard again the beating on the threshing floor, and felt the old familiar rush of the winnowing wind. Cincinnatus returning then would have recognized the plough in common use as about the same in form as that which he once abandoned on his farm beyond the Tiber. But with the spread of publications, the extension of learning, the protection now at last obtained and enforced for inventions, and with the foundations laid and the guide-posts erected in nearly every art and science by previous discoverers, inventors and writers, the century was now ready to start on that career of inventions which has rendered it so glorious. As the turning over and loosening of the sod and the soil for the reception of seed was, and still is, the first step in the art of agriculture, the plough is the first implement to be considered in this review. A plough possesses 5 essential features: a frame or beam to which the horses are attached and which is provided with handles by which the operator guides the plough, a share to sever the bottom of a slice of land, the furrow, from the land beneath, a mould board following the share to turn the furrow over to one side, and a land side, the side opposite the mould board and which presses against the unploughed ground and steadies the plough. To these have been commonly added a device called the coulter, which is a knife or sharp disc fastened to the frame in advance of the share and adapted to cut the sod or soil so that the furrow may be more easily turned, an adjustable gauge wheel secured to the beam in advance of the coulter, and which runs upon the surface of the soil to determine by the distance between the perimeter of the wheel at the bottom and the bottom of the ploughshare the depth of the furrow, and a clevis, which is an adjustable metal strap attached to the end of the beam to which the draft is secured, and by which the pitch of the beam and the depth and width of the furrow are regulated. The general features, the beam, handles, and share, have existed in plows from the earliest ages in history. A plow with a metal share was referred to by the prophecy of Isaiah 7 centuries before Christ. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and such a plow with the coulter and gauge wheel added is found in the Caelus collection of Greek antiquities. The inventions of centuries in plows have proceeded along the lines of the elements above enumerated. The leading features of the modern plow with a share and mold board constructed to run in a certain track and turn its furrows one over against the other, appear to have originated in Holland in the 18th century, and from there were made known to England. James Small of Scotland wrote of and made ploughs having a cast iron mould board and cast and wrought iron shares in 1784–85. In America, about the same time, Thomas Jefferson studied and wrote upon the proper shape to be given to the mould board. Charles Newbold in 1797 took out the first patent in the United States for a plow, all parts cast in one piece of solid iron except the beam and handles. It is a favorite idea with some writers and with more talkers, that when the necessity really arises for an invention, the natural inventive genius of man will at once supply it. Nothing was more needed and sought after for 30 centuries among tillers of the soil than a good plow, and what finally supplied it was not necessity alone, but improved brains. Long were the continued efforts, stimulated no doubt in part by necessity, but stimulated also by other motives, to which allusion has already been made, and among which are the love of progress, the hope of gain, and legislative protection in the possession of inventive property. The best plans of writers and inventors of the 18th century were not fully developed until the 19th, and it can be safely said that within the last 100 years a better plough has been produced than in all of the thousands of years before. The defects which the 19th century's improvements in ploughs were designed to remedy can best be understood by first realizing what was the condition of ploughs in common use when the century opened. Different parts of the plough, such as the share and coulter, were constructed of iron, but the general practice among farmers was to make the beam and frame, handles and mould board of strong and heavy timber. The beam was straight, long, and heavy, and that and the mould generally hewed from a tree. The mould board on both sides, to prevent its wearing out too rapidly, was covered with more or less thick plates of iron. The handles were made from crooked branches of trees. The beam, it is said, was set at any pitch that fancy might dictate, with the handles fastened on almost at right angles with it, thus leaving the ploughman little control over his implement, which did its work in a very slow and imperfect manner. It was some such plough that Lord Kames complained about in The Gentleman Farmer in 1768, as being used in Scotland. 2 horses and 2 oxen were necessary to pull it. The ridges in the fields were high and broad, in fact enormous masses of accumulated earth, that could not admit of cross-ploughing or cultivation, shallow ploughing, universal ribbing, by which half the land was left untilled, a general practice over the greater part of Scotland, a continual struggle between the corn and weeds for superiority. As late as 1820 an American writer was making the same complaint. "Your furrows," he said, "stand up like the ribs of a lean horse in the month of March. A lazy ploughman may sit on the beam and count every bout of his day's work. Besides, the greatest objection to all these ploughs is that they do not perform the work well, and the expense is enormous for blacksmith work." It was complained by another that it took 8 or 10 oxen to draw it, a man to ride upon the beam to keep it on the ground, and a man followed the plough with a heavy iron hoe to dig up the baulks. The improvements made in the plough during the century have had for their object to lessen the great friction between the wide, heavy, ill-formed share and mould board, and the ground, which has been accomplished by giving to the share a sharp, clean, tapering form, and to the mould board a shape best calculated to turn the furrow slice, to improve the line of draught so that the pull of the team may be most advantageously employed, which has been effected after long trials, study and experiment in the arrangement of beam, clevis and draught rod, setting the coulter at a proper angle and giving the land side a plain and parallel surface, to increase the wear and lessen the weight of the parts, which has been accomplished by ingenious processes in treating the metal of which the parts are composed, and lessening the number of parts, to render the plough easily repairable by casting the parts in sets and numbering them, by which any part may be replaced by the manufacturer without resort to the blacksmith. In short, there is no part of the plough but what has received the most careful attention of the inventor. This has been evidenced by the fact that in the United States alone nearly 11,000 patents on ploughs were issued during the 19th century. When it is considered that all the applications for these patents were examined as to their novelty, before the grant of the patent, the enormous amount of study and invention expended on this article can be appreciated. Among the century's improvements in this line is the use of discs in place of the old shovel blades to penetrate the earth and revolve in contact therewith. Cutting discs are harnessed to steam motors and are adapted to break up at one operation a wide strip of ground. The long-studied problem of employing a gang of ploughs to plough back and forth and successfully operated by steam has been solved, and electricity is now being introduced as a motor in place of steam. Thus millions of broad acres which never would have been otherwise turned are now cultivated. The tired muscle-strained ploughman who homeward plodded his weary way at night may now comfortably ride at his ease upon the plough, while at the same time the beasts that pull it have a lighter load than ever before. Next to the plough among the implements for breaking, clearing and otherwise preparing the soil for the reception of seed, comes the harrow. From time immemorial it has been customary to arm some sort of a frame with wooden or iron spikes to scratch the earth after the ploughing. But this century has greatly improved the old constructions. Harrows are now found everywhere, made in sections to give flexibility to the frame, collected in gangs to increase the extent of operation, made with discs instead of spikes, with which to cut the roots of weeds and separate the soil, instead of merely scratching them. A still later invention, curved spring teeth, has been found far superior to spikes or discs in throwing up, separating and pulverizing the soil. A harrow comprising two ranks of oppositely curved trailing teeth is especially popular in some countries. These three distinct classes of harrows, the disc type, the curved spring-tooth type, and gangs of sections of concavo-convex discs, particularly distinguish this class of implements from the old forms of previous ages.